The exact moment my marriage began to fracture didn't happen during a screaming match behind closed doors, but rather right in front of my entire family at the Thanksgiving dinner table. My stepdaughter, Clara, a 21-year-old university student, looked across the table, locked eyes with me, and loudly proclaimed that I was nothing more than a glorified babysitter who happened to sign some marriage paperwork. The room went completely silent as my mother, my brother, and my sister-in-law froze, their forks suspended in midair. I turned to my wife, Evelyn, fully expecting her to defend me, but instead, she calmly set down her wine glass and uttered the words that changed everything, telling me that Clara wasn't my daughter and that I had no right to correct her. As a man who spent nearly 3 decades navigating high-stress military deployments before establishing a successful corporate security consulting firm in Virginia, I have learned the absolute necessity of emotional control. Volatile situations require a steady hand and a calculated mind, not an impulsive outburst, so I simply took a slow sip of water and smiled back at Clara as if she had just shared a fascinating piece of trivia. While the rest of the table sat paralyzed by the sheer awkwardness of the insult, my mind was already operating with tactical precision, mapping out the exact steps I was going to take next. My name is Marcus Vance, and at 53 years old, I have built a life rooted in discipline, respect, and the foundational belief that commitments are meant to be honored. I first met Evelyn roughly 2.5 years ago at a regional gala supporting veteran families, and I was immediately drawn to her commanding presence. As a senior hospital administrator, she was sharp, independent, and fiercely protective of her daughter, Clara, whom she had raised entirely on her own since the girl was 8 years old, following a bitter divorce. Because my own early marriage had ended long before children entered the picture, I approached this new relationship with complete transparency, fully accepting that entering Evelyn's life meant accepting her daughter as part of the package. What I failed to recognize at the time was that their mother-daughter bond was an exclusive fortress, governed by the unwritten rule that Clara's desires superseded absolutely everything else, and anyone who challenged that dynamic would be immediately discarded. When Evelyn and I married 11 months ago, during a beautiful autumn ceremony in the Blue Ridge Mountains, the underlying tension became impossible to ignore. My brother and mother had traveled across the country to celebrate with us, but Clara spent the entire wedding day with her arms tightly crossed, radiating a distinct aura of resentful obligation. I mistakenly dismissed her behavior as transitional anxiety, choosing to give her the benefit of the doubt as a young adult, adjusting to a major family shift. Our financial arrangement dictated that Evelyn would continue funding Clara's off-campus apartment, tuition, car payments, and monthly allowances, which I supported without complaint since I had no intention of forcing myself into a paternal role she never asked for. Instead of trying to force a father-daughter bond, I focused on establishing a baseline of mutual respect and decency, making consistent, quiet efforts to show Clara that I was fully invested in her well-being. For the first few months of the marriage, Clara treated me with a calculated, frosty politeness, entering our home like a reluctant guest and leaving the absolute moment dinner concluded. Evelyn never intervened, nor did she ever encourage her daughter to offer me a genuine chance. Yet I continued to show up whenever help was needed. When Clara suffered a catastrophic tire blowout on the highway during a freezing February ice storm, I was the one who drove out at midnight to stand by her side until the emergency vehicle arrived. My support wasn't limited to roadside emergencies. Whenever an obstacle arose in Clara's academic or professional life, I quietly stepped in to clear the path without seeking recognition. During her stressful spring finals week, her laptop crashed entirely, prompting me to visit a local electronics store the very next morning to purchase a top-tier replacement and leave it on her desk. Later that semester, when she was struggling to secure a competitive corporate summer internship due to a lack of professional networking connections, I utilized my company letterhead to pen a comprehensive recommendation that ultimately secured her the position. Clara never offered a single word of appreciation, and while Evelyn would occasionally label my actions as kind, she never once expected her daughter to show gratitude. If you are currently listening to this and have ever navigated the complex, often thankless minefield of a blended family, you understand the exhausting reality of offering love to people who view you as an intruder. Before we move into the darker turning point of this story, please take a brief moment to hit that subscribe button and share your thoughts in the comments. section below regarding how you would have managed this situation. Drop a like on this video if you have ever had to. Mask deep betrayal with a calm smile while your mind quietly formulated a completely new strategy. The holiday was supposed to be a celebration of our new family unity, but it quickly transformed into the ultimate catalyst for the collapse of our household. Hosting Thanksgiving at my home in Roanoke was something I had spent an entire week meticulously planning, specifically because my elderly mother had flown in from Florida and my brother's family had driven down from Pennsylvania. I spent days smoking a premium turkey using a specialized military technique, while simultaneously recreating my grandmother's classic cornbread dressing from an old faded recipe card. Evelyn had prepared the traditional side dishes. My brother supplied an abundance of quality wine, and the house felt genuinely warm until Clara arrived late in the afternoon. She walked through the front door with the familiar, heavy energy of someone performing a chore, barely acknowledging the beautiful environment or the effort that had gone into welcoming her. My mother greeted Clara with the unconditional warmth of a traditional Southern matriarch, immediately engaging her in conversation about her business studies and her recent internship experiences. Clara provided short, automated responses that offered the bare minimum amount of politeness required to avoid looking overtly hostile before we finally transitioned to the dining room. With the candles lit and the food passed around, the table looked like a perfect portrait of family harmony, completely masking the undercurrent of resentment waiting to explode. As the conversation flowed, I casually asked Clara how her upcoming winter economics exams were going, genuinely wanting to know if the specialized tutor I had personally sourced and financed for her had been beneficial. Clara paused, slowly lowered her fork, and leveled a look of unadulterated contempt directly at me that felt entirely disconnected from the casual nature of my question. She sneered, telling me that the exams were fine, before pointedly adding that a simple security guard wouldn't possess the intellectual capacity to understand advanced university coursework anyway. The entire room plunged into a suffocating silence, my mother's hand freezing over the serving platter while my brother shifted uncomfortably in his seat, maintaining complete vocal control. I calmly responded that while my background was grounded in field operations rather than academia, I was merely showing interest in her progress. Clara leaned back into her chair, a cold smirk forming on her face as she decided to push the confrontation to an entirely irreversible level in front of my guests. She stated that I asked an excessive amount of questions for someone who wasn't an actual member of the family. Before delivery, the final insult of calling me a glorified babysitter who simply signed a marriage certificate. My brother immediately put his silverware down with a heavy thud, while my mother stared at Clara in absolute disbelief, shocked by the blatant disrespect occurring at her son's table. I immediately looked at Evelyn, searching her face for the standard defensive reaction of a loyal partner, waiting for her to establish boundaries. Instead of correcting her daughter's appalling behavior, Evelyn looked directly at me with a cold, detached expression and softly told me that Clara wasn't my child, instructing me not to discipline her. With that single sentence, she validated the insult, took a bite of her food, and completely isolated me at my own holiday dinner. I sat in that silence for 3 seconds, allowing my decades of military discipline to completely separate my immediate emotional pain from the strategic execution of my next moves. I smiled calmly at my stepdaughter, reassured my visibly shaken mother with a gentle look, and seamlessly redirected the conversation toward an upcoming travel plan, ensuring the dinner concluded without further public incident. The smile I maintained for the remainder of the evening was not an act of forgiveness, but rather the quiet cover for a total financial and relational restructuring. Early the next morning, while Evelyn was still asleep, I contacted my corporate attorney to review the precise terms of the prenuptial agreement we had executed prior to our wedding. He confirmed within 15 minutes that every asset, account, and property I owned was entirely protected, and that any financial assistance I provided to Clara was completely voluntary and revocable. Next, I contacted the university's billing department and officially terminated my authorization to pay the substantial portion of Clara's tuition that I had been covering to relieve Evelyn's personal budget. My third phone call was to the automotive dealership where I had previously co-signed a high-end vehicle lease for Clara, informing them that I was initiating the process to legally detach my name from the financial contract. I didn't act out of blind rage, nor did I make these choices to intentionally damage anyone. I simply removed my resources from an environment where they were actively disrespected. By mid-morning, Evelyn was in the kitchen brewing coffee, acting as though the previous evening's absolute betrayal had been nothing more than a minor, forgotten blip in our domestic routine. I pulled up a stool at the kitchen island, looked at her calmly, and stated that we needed to address the reality of what occurred at dinner. Evelyn sighed defensively, waving her hand as she explained that Clara was merely experiencing a difficult transition period and that I was blowing a young adult's thoughtless comment entirely out of proportion. I looked at her steadily, reminding her that her daughter had publicly humiliated me in front of my extended family, and that her response as a wife was to completely validate the disrespect. Evelyn's demeanor instantly hardened as she stated that she refused to allow me to create unnecessary conflict with her daughter, reiterating that Clara would always remain her absolute priority. I quietly thought about the late-night rescue missions, the expensive laptop, the corporate recommendations, and the thousands of dollars I had freely contributed to a family that viewed me as entirely expendable. I finished my coffee, informed Evelyn that I was heading into the firm's office for the afternoon, and spent the remainder of the weekend finalizing the complete separation of my finances. When you realize that your investments of time, money, and genuine care are viewed as automatic entitlements rather than valued gifts, the only logical response is a total retraction. Evelyn called my office the following Monday afternoon, her usually composed administrator voice completely replaced by a high-pitched, panicked tone as the financial reality of my actions began to set in. She demanded to know why she had just received urgent notifications from both the university bursar's office and the automotive dealership regarding immediate past due balances. I calmly explained that I had simply withdrawn my voluntary financial contributions, noting that since I was merely a glorified babysitter, it was no longer appropriate for me to fund an adult's lifestyle. Evelyn screamed that Clara would lose her campus housing and her vehicle within the week, accusing me of using financial manipulation to punish a young girl for a single, thoughtless sentence. I told her to look at the massive contradiction in her words, pointing out how she had shifted from calling the insult an overreaction to now labeling it a thoughtless mistake. I made it clear that I was no longer willing to pour my hard-earned resources into a household where my presence was treated as entirely optional. The weeks that followed were defined by a heavy, suffocating silence as Evelyn scrambled to restructure her personal finances, eventually taking on full responsibility for the tuition and car payments at a massive personal cost. The tension finally culminated on a rainy Sunday evening when Evelyn entered my home office, closed the door, and sat across from me with the posture of someone who was completely defeated. She quietly admitted that she had handled the Thanksgiving situation entirely wrong, confessing that her intense fear of upsetting Clara had caused her to lose the ability to enforce basic behavioral boundaries. I acknowledged her apology, but firmly stated that while I understood her maternal instinct, it did not excuse her failure to stand by her husband. Evelyn then revealed that Clara had reached out to her in tears, expressing a desire to come to the house and offer a genuine, face-to-face apology for her behavior at the dinner table. She explained that my elderly mother had quietly called Clara the previous week, delivering a calm, unmistakable lesson on what it means to respect a man who consistently protects and provides for others. When Clara arrived that following weekend, the arrogance was entirely gone from her face, replaced by the quiet humility of a young adult who finally understood that her actions carried real-world consequences. She offered a brief, sincere apology, admitting she had unfairly directed her personal frustrations toward me, which I accepted while firmly establishing that basic respect was now the non-negotiable floor of our interactions. Our marriage survived the storm, but we are currently standing on entirely different ground, attending intensive weekly couples counseling to rebuild the foundational trust that cracked at that Thanksgiving table. I have permanently stepped back from all financial involvement in Clara's life, maintaining a clean, healthy boundary where my goodwill is no longer treated as a blank check for people who take me for granted. My brother called me recently to tell me he had never seen a man handle such an intense public betrayal with that level of tactical restraint and dignity. The ultimate Lesson I walked away with is that protecting yourself doesn't require matching someone else's loud hostility. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is quietly show people what your absence looks like. Please subscribe my channel if you loved your wife.